Marco already mentioned the term zigzagging around in many policy fields, not just on tariffs, but also on Ukraine, or now surprising all of us with what's going on in Iran. Speaking about, I don't know, his willingness to send ground troops on one day, backpedaling on another, saying it's about regime change on one day, saying it's about nuclear facilities the other. And this really gives people a hard time understanding where the United States is heading and what US policy really is.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Events Series. It's very nice to see all of you, so to speak. Once again, we have a global audience from North Carolina and from across the United States, including Washington, D.C., and we have an audience from abroad, such as the UK and Northern Ireland, Germany, Slovenia, Australia, and some other countries. I'm Klaus Lares, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC Chapel Hill. I've run the Krasno Global Affairs series since 2012, and I would like to emphasize that it is our objective to bring some much needed sober thinking and analysis to global affairs. We want to avoid the overly emotional and polarized debate which has become all too common today. We are non-partisan, of course. Today we have two guests, two distinguished scholars from Germany. They are Gerlinde Groitl, based near Munich in Germany, and Marco Overhaus, based in Berlin in Germany. I will introduce them to you in a minute. Thank you, Gerlinde, for joining us today. How are you?
Thank you, Klaus. Great to be with you. Look forward to our conversation.
Thanks a lot. And also thanks to Marco Overhaus for also joining us today. It is, after all, quite late in Germany. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. So it's been a long day, but this is going to be the highlight of the day. So also I'm very happy to be with you, and I'm also looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much. Today we will talk about Europe, the Iran war, and transatlantic relations in its many dimensions. We will talk about both economic and security related issues, and of course about the Iran war and its repercussions for Europe and transatlantic relations with the United States. I would like to encourage our audience to submit questions via the chat function of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants today, Abigail and Sivan, will select them and read them out to all of us. After our initial conversation, Gerlinde and Marco will be more than happy to answer your many questions. Let me introduce Professor Gerlinde Groitl to you briefly. Professor Gerlinde Groitl directs the Institute for Security and Strategy in Munich, and she also teaches international politics at the University of Regensburg. Her scholarly work focuses on international security and strategy, with a special focus on the United States, Germany, the EU, and NATO, as well as great power competition between Russia, China, and the Western world. To date, she has published 3 monographs and has held numerous impressive positions and fellowships in Germany as well as in the UK and the United States. Welcome, Gerlinde. Great to have you with us tonight. And perhaps I should add that Gerlinde and I met some time ago at a conference, and we just saw each other again at the Munich Security Conference.
Thank you, Klaus. And thank you for the very generous introduction.
Absolutely, well deserved. Let me also introduce Dr. Marco Overhaus to you. Dr. Overhaus is a senior research associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. This is Germany's leading think tank, which closely advises the German government. He is also the deputy leader of the research group on the United States at that think tank in Berlin. Marco's main focus is on transatlantic defense cooperation as well as US defense policy in Europe and in the Persian Gulf region. From August 2015 to January 2016, he worked for the policy planning staff and the North America department in the German Foreign Office. Marco has also held positions and fellowships in Germany, France, and the United States. He has published widely on US foreign policy in particular, including a recent book with a very nice title, Big Brother Gone, Europe and the End of the Pax Americano. Thank you both for finding the time to join us today. Let me ask you straight away about the Iran war. What was the reaction in Europe? Was there strong condemnation or strong support for Trump's war? Gerlinde, would you like to start?
Of course. Thank you. Well, there is not one answer from Europe, but there are multiple answers. And actually, no matter what the topic is, this is an answer that usually fits because Europe oftentimes speaks with more than just one voice. Germany has been very forthcoming in its support for US and Israeli policies. And we maybe talk about this a little bit in deeper depth, but I was sort of surprised to see how forthcoming the German government was in its rhetoric. Other European countries have been much more critical, like Spain, first and foremost. And Donald Trump was very vocal and outspoken about it in his recent meeting with Chancellor Merz in the Oval Office, where he praised Germany, but really harshly criticized Spain for a number of reasons. Maybe one thing that I observe very much is that there is no coherent strategy visible from Washington, D.C. So everybody's sort of wondering what the goal is of this military operation. And there's been, I think the Atlantic published a piece that says it depends on which day of the week you ask in Washington what the goal is of the operation. Is it to degrade missile capacities, or is it to attack nuclear facilities? Is it to take out the Iranian Navy? Or is it regime change in the most broadest sense? So many people over here are wondering what kind of policy the US is pursuing. And to date, frankly, I have no clear sense of what the goal is.
Thank you. But explain to us, why would Chancellor Merz, when he was in the Oval Office with Trump, why was he, well, supportive or at least neutral when he is, as you seem to indicate privately, much more critical about having started a war with Iran? Was he
It's
intimidated by
not.
Trump? How do you explain that?
Yeah, I don't see a difference in public and private. I don't know what he says in private to begin with. But he has been very supportive of operations in the sense that in the Oval Office, he said that Germany agrees that this regime must go. And I found that very surprising because military regime change in Iran has to date not been German policy. To the contrary, in the past, there was a lot of emphasis on diplomacy and other ways of dealing with the Iranian threat. And there was, how I saw it, really a discrepancy in the way the chancellor communicated, in that he supported the operation and he was very out there saying that regime change would be a good thing. But at the same time, he came away from Washington with the sense that there is no coherent plan. And this makes this very supportive stance sort of awkward, because if there is no clear plan ahead, yeah, it raises a lot of questions.
What about the question of the legality of the war? Usually, as you know, Germany is most concerned about legality in international affairs and upholding the global order and the rule of law in international affairs. Did that come up in between Merz and Trump?
Well, it actually came up before that. Chancellor Merz gave a press statement on Sunday, March 1st, where he essentially said that, being out there moralizing, having the moral high ground and referring to international law, it doesn't get you anywhere because the reality is just different. And this was another very astounding statement that, on the one hand, acknowledging just the basic truth that currently we see a lot of bullying internationally, a lot of great power politics with little regard to international law. But hearing a German chancellor say it was surprising for many, because in other instances, there was always a very vocal emphasis on the need to respect international law. And here the chancellor essentially said, well, bad luck, we tried hard with Iran, but there was really nothing to do about the hedging the aggressive intentions of this regime. And he made that kind of statement again after his meeting with Donald Trump, that we've tried hard within the boundaries of international law to deal with the Iranian threat, but it has not worked. And he made it very clear that he saw an imminent threat to Israeli security first and foremost, and he was not willing to wait too long, essentially.
Thank you. Did that actually find the support of his party, the Christian Democrats, or was Merz a lonely voice who voiced these views?
The way I see it, there's a lot of support. Of course, there are also critical voices raising the alarm bells about, international law and was there really an imminent threat? And isn't there another way to deal with it? And is it really strategically smart to go about this way? Having said that, maybe I should add, just to make sure that our American viewers and listeners do not get confused. So there is no German active support for that operation. We are just talking about the rhetorical dimension. We're not involved in that campaign. But I was surprised to see a wide-ranging degree of support for current operations. And I think it has to do with the great sympathy for the Iranian people, for the Iranian exile community that has been very visible in Germany. Just in recent weeks, we had huge demonstrations in Germany, like in Munich. You were in Munich just recently, Klaus, and there were, I don't know, 200,000 or 250,000 even protesting in Munich for freedom in Iran. So there is a large community sympathizing with the prospect of change in the country. And I think that is also another reason why there is, as I would say, a lot of sympathy for the notion that there might be change.
Okay.
But again, just one warning note, I'm very skeptical that that change will really come about because there are so many indicators that what we are heading towards is really not a blossoming of democracy in Iran, but potentially a lengthy, a very violent, and not necessarily promising outcome.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Marco Overhaus, how divided is Europe regarding the Iran war? Is there any support stronger than what Gerlinde indicated, or is there a lot of criticism, like in Spain and Norway, for example? Is that a widespread sentiment?
Maybe let me, Klaus, add a few comments also on the German debate. I mostly really agree with what Gerlinde has summarized. Maybe I have a slightly different perception on the support for the military aspect for the war. I think it's quite circumscribed. So I would also say that especially the Christian Democratic Party and as Merz stated in the Oval Office 2 days ago, there's support for the desired end goal, so that the regime must go, the mullah regime must go. But I think there's much less enthusiasm, I would say, about the way how the United States now tries to achieve that by war, and that is very, understandable because this is a war that has not begun by Europeans, and Europeans don't have, and Germans and Europeans don't have any say about the conduct of the war or about its termination. So it's and the potential consequences, negative consequences for Germany and Europe are quite huge. So energy prices, gas prices are also going up. You can see it in every gasoline station in Germany. Then there is some anxiety about a repetition of the Syrian refugee crisis, whether it's funded or not. But that is definitely a big topic, and what internal implications this would have. The further rise of right populism in Germany, and so there's a lot of potential negativity with regard to the consequences. And so I think, so that the desired end goal is shared, but not necessarily the way it is now tried to being achieved. And also, of course, the other parties in Germany, the Social Democrats and the Greens, are very skeptical. With regard to...
Can I just interrupt you? Were you surprised by Chancellor Merz's words in the Oval Office? Did you think he was more surprised than you thought?
I was quite like Gerlinde. I was also surprised, and Gerlinde, you also said this also publicly. Just like Gerlinde, I was also surprised that we didn't have much more of a debate about that. So the Chancellor said this, and then no one seemed to question it. I was a bit surprised about that too. But my explanation is always, it's all about Ukraine in the end at the moment. It's really that is the focus of the German government and also of most of the German population, I would say. At least the security people who deal with security issues are focused very much on Ukraine. And I think everything what the chancellor is doing when he is visiting Washington is really indeed about Ukraine. So keeping the United States, keeping the Trump administration somehow in the loop with regard to Ukraine is really the primary objective. And so I guess the idea was not to alienate the president and not to lose the Trump's support, for Ukraine. I think that was the primary aim. But yes, the overall European picture is mixed. But again, I would still say you really have to look hard to find enthusiasts of the Iran war in the European theater, in the European countries. I mean, the Spaniards have been most forthcoming with regard to, at least the socialist government in Spain has been very critical, but the UK has also been quite critical. And so I think the overall feeling is that the negative repercussions of the Iran war will be felt in Europe, and that we should really focus on something else at this point, and which is mostly Ukraine.
Thanks very much indeed. Tell us, moving on from that, tell us a little bit, Marco, how is Trump viewed in Europe? Is there, of course, I know there's a lot of criticism, particularly about his tariff policy, but is there also a sentiment that perhaps we misunderstand him, that he has larger strategic goals which are not all that bad, and we often do him injustice?
Well, it really depends on whom you talk to. So I mean, I'm sure the right wing, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany is quite sympathetic to Trump, and maybe there are also other people in the conservative spectrum who would have a more nuanced view on Trump and on the United States, foreign policy conduct at this moment. But I would say overall it is quite negative. So it's really, and the problem is really to understand, not only with regard to Iran, but in general, to understand what is the strategy, what is the policy. I mean, on Ukraine, it's been, I mean, the last 12 or 14 months since the inauguration of the second Trump administration, Ukraine relations or Ukraine negotiations have been mostly about, Trump and about finding ways to win over Trump, whereas Russia has tried the opposite. And so there's a lot of unclear, there's a lot of doubt about this. And then there's, of course, the zigzag with the tariffs and on off. So you have tariffs and then you negotiate and then it becomes unpredictable again. So I think there's a broadly shared, mostly negative view on Trump, but the fundamental question that really everybody shares is, what is really the strategy and what is the aim of the Trump administration in certain areas?
Thank you. Gerlinde, the same question to you. Do you feel there's a great misunderstanding of Trump, or would you fully agree with what Marco has just outlined?
I think the hard part is that there is sort of, I guess, an underlying group of people with a strategic sense of where the US should be heading, like Elbridge Colby and others. But then there is Donald Trump, and Marco already mentioned the term zigzagging around in many policy fields, not just on tariffs, but also on Ukraine, or now surprising all of us with what's going on in Iran, speaking about, I don't know, his willingness to send ground troops on one day, backpedaling on another, saying it's about regime change on one day, saying it's about nuclear facilities the other. And this really gives people a hard time understanding where the United States is heading and what US policy really is, because it might be totally different the next day. And this is hard to bear for not only Germany as a country, but Europe as a continent that is so dependent on the United States, where you want stability and We are so used to having a very predictable, very stable relationship with the United States. And this seems to be really gone for the moment because there are so many surprises. And the Trump administration operates unlike previous administrations in the sense that they don't consult with Europeans before they take action. So repeatedly, European leaders were surprised by whatever the Trump administration did. For example, coming out with a 28-point plan that was negotiated between the United States and Russia about how to handle Ukraine. And seemingly nobody in Europe was informed or in the loop what these discussions were about to produce. Or the attack on Iran. As far as I know, and as far as the reporting goes, there's been no consultation, no prior necessarily, I don't know, interaction between the United States and Europe. So people are surprised and surprised and surprised, and this strains the relationship because it's something that we are not used to, and it's something that is really hard to handle politically when you're dealing with your closest ally that is all of a sudden pursuing its policy very independently and unilaterally and with little regards to European preferences.
Thank you. You said for the moment, so you don't see the transatlantic relationship is dead for good, but you see this as temporary difficulties, maybe a difficult phase, and then we will all go back to the happy, harmonious past. Is that the way you envisage it?
No, you will never go back to the past. You know, if there is one rule of thumb in life, the past is in the past and it will never come back. But I am more optimistic maybe than others that there is a shared set of interests between Europe and the United States that can be operationalized for the future. So it's not a divorce that we are necessarily heading towards, but we can potentially reinvigorate that alliance. I know it's hard right now because there is a lot of, as Marco described, antipathy and Jesus Christ, dislike of Donald Trump on this side of the Atlantic, which makes it hard for political leaders even to sustain sort of a balanced, stable relationship. And on the other side of the Atlantic, leading figures in the Trump administration view Europe not only as irrelevant, but as even opponents or enemies or rivals in some senses. So this is really hard to pull it off right now. But when we think about the long game and the bigger picture in world affairs, what other countries are there that share more interests than Europe and the United States? So I think there is still room for improvement to reinvigorate the partnership for the future. And I know Marco likely will disagree because I think we're...
Marco, come on in. Yeah. Are you as optimistic as Gerlinde, or are you more pessimistic?
No, let me add maybe one thing. I mean, because Klaus, you asked about maybe do people think that Trump is also misunderstood, or that there might be something positive, and if you take away this this incoherence and this unpredictability and this zigzagging, and try to find some strategic goalposts or predictability, so things that are more certain in this particular conservative Republican administration. You could talk about tougher migration policies. You would talk about Europeans assuming a larger share of the defense burden in Europe. You could talk about taking the China threat seriously and a need for reducing economic dependencies on China. So if the debate would be about that, about how to manage migration, how to manage defense policy, how to manage China, then there would be, I guess, more positive reception in parts of the German, political spectrum and other European countries, because that is nothing totally alien to us. Probably more on the Conservative Party side than on the left side, but that is not. I mean, we are not even getting to discuss these things because, as we have already discussed, the focus is changing all the time, and then comes something like Greenland. and you know, all the basis for a more substantial debate across the Atlantic is gone, because everybody's talking about Greenland and how it could, you know, kill NATO, so to speak. And I think that is the problem. So if there would be more of a consistency and a clearer message from Washington, then there would be a basis. And maybe in the future, even under different circumstances, we will have a basis again. It will be a different relationship, but it will be still, we can have a conversation, but that's very hard at the moment under this, you know, zigzagging.
Yeah. Can I jump in with just one additional thought? I agree with what Markus said, but I want to point out that I think there is a difference between how the political elites respond to Donald Trump, because the German government tries really a hugging strategy. So Friedrich Merz is working hard to have a positive personal relationship and emphasize the commonalities and how close we are, whatever the differences of the day may be. But there is a difference between that elite attitude and approach to the Trump administration and what I see in public discussions. Because in public discussions, I think what Markus said is not necessarily applicable. That we're, you know, we could talk about the real issues, migration and, I don't know, climate and NATO policy, etc. But there is a very strong and dislike of Donald Trump, and this colors very much the way the reporting is about the Trump administration and how public discussions go about the Trump administration. And it often starts from a premise that whatever Trump does must be bad because we dislike him so much. And this is a very a destructive way of having a discourse about what's going on in the United States, because we do have quite a few similarities in our own political systems and in own political debates, that we should really try to understand the phenomenon of Donald Trump and why he's so successful and how his MAGA movement came about in the United States with just intellectual curiosity, because I think much of this applies to our polities here in Europe as well, because we have the same dynamics. And oftentimes, I think we don't get to the discussion of whatever lies underneath his success, because the premise in many of the debates is, oh, it's horrible what we're seeing in the United States. It's the end of democracy. It's the end of liberalism, etc., etc. So it's a very blunt picture, I perceive. And it's very different to what we see at the political level, where there is always the attempt to find the commonality and keep the relationship on an even keel.
Thank you. When you look at the world from Trump's point of view, then you would assume a rational being would think, I cannot afford to alienate my trusted European allies too much, because I may need them in a future security situation, also, of course, for trade relations. And we saw only now with the Iran war, the United States wanted to have 2 British bases at its disposal, which initially was refused. And then, of course, Starmer changed his mind. But alienating the Europeans doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. But the Trump administration goes ahead with it anyway, and they talk about civilizational erasure and all that baggage which comes with it. How do you explain that? What is the reasoning which is going on in the minds of the Trump administration? Marco, perhaps.
Well, as I interpret the Trump administration, it's clear to me that this administration, this president, and his team, his ministers and advisors, they do not want to abandon Europe. But what they want to do is to rewrite the terms and conditions of that relationship. I mean, you mentioned the book that I just recently wrote, and in that book, I try to describe these 3 pillars that have underwritten the transatlantic relationship over the last several decades. So, alliance commitments, the first one. Second, open economies across the Atlantic. Having trade relationships and open economies. And the third one was, the normative value that, in the end, both sides of the Atlantic value liberal democratic norms. And now what the Trump administration, I think, is trying to do is to rewrite these terms and conditions. So alliance commitments become purely transactional. Economic protectionism is the order of the day, and on a normative dimension, the Trump administration tries to redefine what the essence of the West is. And now this has been very clear on display with J.D. Vance's speech last year in the Munich Security Conference, and has been a little bit more hidden, but still on display with the Marco Rubio speech at this year's MSC. So basically, it's not about universal liberal values anymore. It's about, more ethnic nationalist values. It's about Christian religion being a core feature of the West. And so that is something fundamentally different than the last, decades on all of these three dimensions: economy, military, and values. And that's how I would interpret, the Trump administration. So it doesn't want to abandon Europe. As you said, Klaus, they also need Europe in a certain way, but preferably on a bilateral basis. So the Trump administration despises of the European Union, which is seen as a liberal monster. And I think that is the real challenge now for the German government and for other European governments, how to react to this attempt to rewrite the terms and conditions of a relationship.
Thank you. Gerlinde, is that a fair interpretation, or would you have a different one?
I'd like to jump in on the last point about redefining the West, because it seems that we don't see a division between the United States on one hand and Europe on the other, but we have the very same debates across European democracies as well.
True.
So I was struck that after the speech Marco Rubio gave at the Munich Security Conference, initially there were standing ovations, and then it took a while, and people were like, "Oh, well, wait a minute, wasn't that just what J.D. Vance said last year, but maybe with a nicer tone?" And then everybody's like, we didn't like the speech so much after all. I thought it was a missed opportunity to put that away as, oh, it's just MAGA culture wars, and we don't want to have any of it in Europe, because we're already having these kinds of debates in Europe, and I think we have to talk about these things. Who are we as a nation, as a community of nations, as the West? Because obviously there seems to be a political need to discuss these things, and whether there may be something, I don't know, are we with the way we define liberalism? And that's a fair political debate, because the liberal state for me is one that leaves its citizens alone, gives protection, but doesn't interfere too much in the life of its citizens. And increasingly, I think we have in our democracies some tendencies that the state takes on ever larger roles. A lot of interventionism in the economy, for example, high investment quotas in the economy. There are some political fields that seem to be not up for debate anymore, even though they are core political debates that we need to have in our polities, up to the point where the question arises whether internationalization and the transfer of sovereignty beyond the nation state is really what citizens want, and whether that might as well produce some democracy deficits. Because there must be a reason why across Europe and in the United States, taking back control, meaning that citizens demand that their state takes back control from some other international entities, where that falls on fertile ground. So I think we're already having these kinds of debates across the Atlantic. So it's not the United States versus Europe. And having those debates explicitly would help us here, but also help the transatlantic relationship in a larger sense.
Sure, thank you. But essentially what you're saying is that Trump and J.D. Vance do have a point. Maybe not much as a point as they seem to believe themselves, but they are making at least some relative points, and that also Hungary and Slovakia, for example, within the European Union, who would be closely aligned with the Trump administration rather than with the EU Commission, and Germany and France and so on, also have a point. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and they are just part of the European political spectrum as well. They won't go away, whether we like it or not, they are part of the political spectrum, just like we have voters in Germany voting for the AfD or in France for Rassemblement National. So we have to figure out a way to find a consensus in our own democracies, what it is that we are quarreling over politically and what are no-go areas that we do not agree with. But it seems that sometimes we avoid these conversations, and that's not helpful because majorities are as they are.
Okay.
I don't have an answer how to
Can I?
solve that.
Marco, does Gerlinde have a point, or does Trump and JD Vance have a point?
Yeah, I mean, I have to, and this is maybe the first point where I might disagree with Gerlinde. I mean, I agree fully that we have these debates also in Germany, and that this is not a purely transatlantic divide, but also an inner German and inner European debate about what defines the West, who are we, who are the others, what does liberalism mean these days. That's all true, but the problem I have is, I mean, there are certain limits, that I think we should draw. So certain red lines we should draw, and in my view, the Trump administration is overstepping these limits all the time. So it's fine for me to discuss, as I said, I mean, let's talk about migration. Let's talk about, what values should we cherish? Let's talk about, I mean, the classical thing has been the COVID pandemic, where, critical voices of the current policies vis-a-vis COVID have been criticized and they have been silenced. That's all. It has been not been very good. Or people who in Germany were critical of open borders have been criticized and silenced. That has not been a very good thing. So I agree with that. But the limits, I mean, is when you try to exclude, certain groups from the electorate, or from citizens that have rights. And I think that is exactly the point where, for instance, I have problems with our German Alternative für Deutschland. And this is also the point where I would say I have problems with what the Trump administration is doing domestically inside the United States. So it's fine to debate these things, but when you start to exclude certain groups, then you have a problem, right? I mean, so-called non-documented.
I have to jump in here really quickly. Sorry for interrupting, Marco, but you introduced your remarks by saying that you disagree with me on this point, and we don't disagree here at all, not in the least.
Okay, so maybe it was not I would, maybe, try to bring this debate a bit further and say I would agree that, yeah, we have to discuss it, but there are certain limits. And in the United States, I mean, we talked a little bit about.
Can you define the limits? What limits do we have?
Yeah, I mean, the limit, from my view, is both in Germany and in the United States, is when you try to exclude certain groups from and to deprive them from certain rights, right?
Okay,
I mean, in the United States, for instance, if you have non-documented migrants, but they still have certain rights, due process, or habeas corpus enshrined in the United States Constitution. So you can, and the same in Germany also, and that is what has been.
Yeah, absolutely. And beyond migration, what other limits regarding other policy fields have been overstepped by Trump, for example?
Another one is, I don't know, executive overreach and balances of power. I mean, this is now a purely domestic issue in the United States, and that's something we observe in Germany. But I think that I would, see it with some concern that the United States Congress has mostly given up its role of controlling the presidency in the United States. I mean, that has also a certain foreign policy dimension and security policy dimension, because in the first Trump administration, Congress was still something like a corrective on some also foreign policy decisions of Trump. And also German policymakers have seen members of Congress in the United States as allies, that you should work with also to check some of the policies of the first Trump administration. That is something that is not visible anymore in the second Trump administration. So, all these things about, balances of power, yeah, how do you define civil rights? Who has these rights? I think these are important aspects, very crucial aspects. How do you deal with the media? How do you deal with political opponents? Do you respect them in principle, or do you treat them as enemies? And what role does the military have domestically? It's something we also, we have a very close exchange between U.S. and German armies, and the
Please,
way
thank
that.
you. Let me refer to a hot potato, at least in the United States, but I think elsewhere as well. A lot of people, not just Trump supporters, argue, and I'm trying to be devil's advocate here, they argue that diversity and the so-called woke culture and political correctness has gone way too far, and that Trump is actually correcting something which has gone out of kilter. And would you say he has a point, or is that also just propaganda by the Trump administration?
And you ask me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say again. I would say that is something overstepping limits. You could always ask about the proper means. So do you? How far do you regulate into companies and societies? Mandating certain types of behavior, and maybe in the past that has been overdone to some extent. But I think in general, I don't know, protecting rights of sexual minorities, that is absolutely crucial for a democracy. And I think that is also something for me that. That is a limit. When you overstep that limit, it's the question whether you're still a democracy. I would say yes.
And as our previous speaker, Gareth Evans, said, it's a matter of decency and morality as well, and common sense, and not necessarily law and regulations, but simple human decency. But how would you see that, Gerlinde? Do you think Trump has a point when he says that all that political correctness, diversity, and so on has gone too far and needs to be reined in? Or is he overstepping it himself?
Well, I think he's overstepping it definitely when it comes to the language, the rhetoric, uh, the I think Marco already mentioned when you don't take other political voices seriously, when you even demonize them as enemy of the peoples, you're way beyond the norms of democratic discourse. But I think you can be critical of DEI initiatives because they have a, from my point of view, questionable view of the basics of our society. Because when I look at democratic societies, I start with the individual. And what you see in a lot of those DEI thinking and policies is that you pre-select societies into predefined groups. And this is, I think, incompatible with a liberal society where you don't look at individuals as what they are, namely individuals, but you see them as representatives of predefined groups. And then you have a quota thinking that permeates everything. And so I think there is legitimate room to criticize DEI initiatives. And I would prefer having more of those criticism in a reasonable way and in a decent way, and not just, throwing everything out the window and belittling others and being very, missing the basic level of decency that you should have in human discourse and interaction. But
Yeah.
yes, I see a lot of room to criticize DEI initiatives, for example.
Thanks very much. I'm sure we will have plenty of questions about that. And I would like to remind our audience to please submit your questions in writing, and we will come to them in a few minutes. I just wanted to get to two other points here. That is China, briefly at least. There's often the assumption that the alienation of the Europeans from the Trump administration and that tension and that these difficulties which we see in transatlantic relations right now is pushing the Europeans to move closer to China. And recently, of course, Chancellor Merz, but Prime Minister Starmer, French President Macron, the Finnish Prime Minister, and many other European leaders, and the Canadian Prime Minister, they all went to China to cozy up to Xi Jinping and to improve relations with China. So does that actually confirm the Europeans are moving away from the United States and looking more and more towards China. Can you explain that to us, Marco?
I'm not so sure if the conduct of the Trump administration is the biggest driver in our China policy. I think there's a general understanding that we need to diversify our economic and political, but mostly economic relationships. I mean, China is still the most important market for Germany, and for many other European countries, it's an important market.
But
So you cannot.
may I interrupt? Without Trump, would there be that belief that the Europeans need to diversify, or has only Trump caused that belief to rise up?
Yeah, that's the point I want to make. I mean, Trump is an important part of the equation, but it's a more general, it's a general movement. It's a general development. I mean, it has been on display. It started all with didn't start all with it, but it started, or the important impetus has been the Ukraine war, the Russian war in Ukraine, and especially German dependence on Russian energy. That was a very important trigger point where we said we need to diversify our energy supplies. And also the problems with China have been going on for a long time and not all of that was related to US policies. And then there came the second Trump administration where Trump quite openly, and that was a new quality, tried to use one-sided dependencies, economic and security policy to coerce European countries. So I think Trump is part of the equation, but it's a whole set of other factors that I think are leading to a realization in Germany that you cannot afford one-sided dependencies. But of course, the dilemma is that when you try to reduce dependency on one actor, you enhance dependency on another. So take gas and natural gas as an example. We reduced Russian gas imports. Now we had more from Qatar, and now we have a problem with Qatar as well. But I think it's part really of an overall development. It's not just driven by the Trump administration.
But can we conclude that the Europeans are kind of squeezed from all sides, now even from Middle Eastern countries, and certainly squeezed by China, squeezed by Trump and the United States? So what is the future for Europe?
It's closer collaboration, right? I mean, that is the one asset that we can have in our hands. I mean, we still have a lot of non-tariff economic barriers, even in the internal market. I mean, there's been some calculations of GDP growth that we could trigger if we would remove all these internal EU barriers, standardization and bureaucracy and so forth. And we will talk surely also about security and how Europe tries to improve its internal security cooperation, defense cooperation. So this is, so this internal balancing, I think that's what this is called. This is where we have the most potential.
Thank you. Gerlinde, are the Europeans moving closer to China, and does that make sense? What is your view?
I mean, Europeans are squeezed between a rock and a hard place because the euphoria about China is long gone because everybody's seeing the disadvantages that deep ties to China have. Even German industry sees it. So there's been a souring of relations, and since 2019, the EU came up with the formula that China is a economic competitor, a global partner in some respects, but also a systemic rival. And this shows you that there is some hedging involved, and there is not only an open arms policy anymore. So I don't see this as a plausible alternative if relations with the United States become difficult, that you move over to China, because this is just not an option and everybody knows it. To the contrary, there is a de-risking policy has been in place set by the EU Commission, trying to minimize risk from dependencies from China for quite a while. It doesn't work ideally because companies are making their own choices and they see the Chinese market as super important, especially the car industry, which is crucial for the German economy. So you see a lot of conflicting developments and trends. The favorite course, I guess, is teaming up with like-minded allies across the globe. So there has been a lot of enthusiasm about working closer with Canada or looking towards Asia to like-minded partners like Japan, like South Korea. The question just is how far that gets you in a world that is increasingly dominated by great powers with little respect for international law. If you're a middle power, you depend on the validity of global norms and rules. So I guess we haven't figured it out yet. And if I may, I would add a cautious note about the prospect of closer European integration. In an ideal world, this is where it would be heading, that every single European state realizes that alone they cannot make any difference in the world. So you have to team up to become sort of a center of gravity and allow Europe to defend its interests and values and norms. But in reality, I think there are a lot of obstacles. To just make the German example, we've talked for more than 10 years now that Germany has to step up and take more responsibility. That's the usual phrase that is used, that we have to take more responsibility internationally. And we've had a Zeitenwende, like a change in eras, that was that Chancellor Scholz mentioned in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine for good and a major invasion. So again and again, we repeat that, oh, now we've realized that we have to move forward and now we have to get our act together. And it's just very slow and very tedious. And you always see the setbacks along the way. Now, of course, setbacks may be natural, but I'm rather skeptic that a full European integration is really on the menu. And especially in security and defense, I think there is no alternative to select European powers taking the lead, which may be a sort of a different model than, I don't know, EU integration taken to a new level, where you also have some proponents arguing for that, but it seems not realistic the
Thank
way
you.
I look at Europe.
And you believe middle powers of the world unite in the end will not be enough?
Well, it's a good start, and there is really not a big menu of options to choose from, so it makes absolute sense to team up with those. But as we see right now with the war in Iran, if a great power like the United States decides to go to war, everybody else is just scrambling to respond. It has negative ramifications. It could also have positive ramifications, of course, but this is just the new normal, I guess, that other countries will do things that go against our interests potentially, and we have to respond to minimize the fallout without being able to shape the development ahead of time to begin with. And it's
Thank you.
not only countries like Russia or China that are doing that to us, but now increasingly also the United States, because it redefines its political role in the world. And it does not necessarily view Europeans as the inevitable partner in redefining that course together.
Yeah, thank you. Marco, you wanted to get in, but let me also ask you, what about the repercussions of the Iran war on Ukraine, on America's policy towards Ukraine? That policy was becoming very soft anyway. Will the US now totally drop Ukraine and leave it all to the Europeans, whether or not Ukraine is supported? How do you see the future development in the Ukraine war?
Okay, I will answer that in a second. Just wanted to, add or maybe clarify. Klaus, when you asked me about, European alternatives, I mean, I agree. I would not say that the solution to European problems of being, torn apart in this brutal world is ever closer union or European federal state necessarily. What I would argue is, and that was the point I was making. I mean, even more modest steps like, really completing the internal market and taking away these internal barriers or barriers for internal trade that should be low-hanging fruits. And I would also very much agree with Gerlinde in terms of security and defense policy. I mean, I don't see a European army in the making, but I see that we have already increased defense cooperation in many ways. and that is a good thing. And that is something that has been very much triggered by the second Trump administration and by the Ukraine war. But it doesn't have to be a European Union superstate at the end with more modest ambitions. And on Ukraine, I mean, basically, I would argue that Europe is already very much alone on Ukraine. I mean, the Trump administration and the United States, they have not fully abandoned Ukraine, but it's very clear that the burden of of arming and of financing Ukraine is now fully on the European Union and on the European part of NATO. I'm also very skeptical that in the end we will see any credible security guarantees for Ukraine if there will be some ceasefire or even some peace agreement. I have a very hard time now looking at the current domestic climate in the United States to see how there could be credible security guarantees. So they will have to also come from Europe at some point. So I think that this has already been decided. I mean, Ukraine is ours to deal with.
Yeah, but may I interrupt? If the United States decided to end intelligence cooperation on behalf of Ukraine or with Ukraine, and if they switched off their Starlink satellite systems and other satellite help they give to Ukraine, then I believe the Europeans can step in as much as they want. They couldn't replace these things, and that would be the end of the Ukraine war, and not in favor of Ukraine. Is that not correct?
Well, yeah, on the satellite thing, I mean, that has been to some degree also privatized in the United States. So maybe it's not so much Washington, but Elon Musk who's deciding on that. But yes, of course, intelligence cooperation is still very important. So yeah, maybe if the United States would really, drop that, that would be very negative for Ukraine. But I try to say that in all these other dimensions, military support and economic support, it's already the thing has already shifted very much to Europeans. So I would say there's not so much. Of course, now you can say the United States could go even further. I don't see why they should do that at this point. But yeah, the burden has already shifted to Europe.
No, I agree with that. What about the so-called peace process? Will the Trump administration push Ukraine to make all these concessions demanded by Putin? Or do you think the peace process has been shifted under the influence of the Europeans in a slightly more favorable way towards Ukraine? Or is that just wishful thinking?
Really depends on the day. I mean, do you talk about today or in a week or in 2 weeks? I mean, the overall, I mean, if there's a strategy, I don't know if there's a strategy, but if there is an overall approach of the Trump administration towards Ukraine, it is to put pressure on mostly on Ukraine to concede territory and to weaken Ukraine in many ways, so that in the end there's a better chance to have a peace deal that is very favorable to Russia. That is how I would see. I mean, if I have to summarize the Trump administration's policy towards Ukraine, that it is. This is
what the rationale for that?
Sorry?
What is the rationale for that?
What is the Russian what?
The rationale for that. Why does the Trump administration favor Russia over Ukraine, as you said?
I mean, you sit in the United States. You tell me. I have a hard time. I don't know. Maybe it's because Trump wants to. I think it's there's a lot of talk about peace through strength. As the doctrine, the Trump doctrine. My interpretation of the Trump doctrine is it's peace for the strong. Yeah, so it's the fact that you look at the different wars of the world and you try to identify who's the stronger side. And the Trump administration has decided it's Russia. So if you support the stronger side, you've got a good chance that the war will end sooner. And that is how I would interpret it. I might be wrong, but that would be my interpretation.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think the prospect of economic cooperation with Russia on investment, new investment relationship with Russia, I think that is also quite attractive to many in the Trump administration. But Gerlinde, how do
Yeah.
you see that? Yeah, what are the role of Ukraine and the repercussions of the Iran war on what is going on in the Ukrainian war?
Well, the repercussions are potentially great because all the interceptors that are used in the Middle East are not available and the stocks are depleted. So the supply for Ukraine might be ebbing out. That's a potential repercussion. Also, attention is going away from Ukraine to other areas. And to take up Chancellor Merz again, in his press statement on March 1st, as well as in his Oval Office visit, he connected the war against Iran with the war in Ukraine, saying that there are a lot of bad guys out there, and he meant Iran as well as Russia, trying to make the case that it's in the United States' interest to remain engaged, supporting Ukraine. As to the rationale of the Trump administration, I think I have a slightly different take. Because for me, the overarching goal the United States pursues is extricating itself from the war in Ukraine, sort of shifting the burden to the Europeans. And if they're not willing to step up, then so be it. And Europeans have to live with the consequences. So I'm not sure whether it's really sympathy for Russia, because the United States is doing a whole lot of things that are really alien to Russian interests, be it the Venezuela operation, be it seizing oil tankers of Russian descent, be it even potentially taking out an ally in Tehran and showing the world that partnership with Russia literally means nothing except for, I don't know, warm words and potentially condolences. This seems to be the level of support that Russia is giving to its allies. So I really dislike the way some folks are always saying, oh, Trump is on Putin's side, because I think Trump is on Trump's side and the United States side as he defines it, and not so much siding with Russia against Ukraine. There's a lot of pressure to get Europeans to step up. There is a lot of, we talked about this zigzagging, which makes it hard to find a coherent line. But the way I interpret it, the overarching rationale is ridding itself of the burdens the Ukraine war poses in order to be able to shift attention elsewhere. Because the Trump administration just doesn't see it as its primary job to take care of Ukraine and siding with Europeans in dealing that or taking care of the conflict for Europeans, not siding with, but taking care of this for us. And under the Biden administration, this was essentially the modus operandi, that the Biden administration shaped the course and Europeans followed suit. And this is something that we shouldn't expect as the normal in transatlantic relations. So we shouldn't be so surprised that the Trump administration seeks to extricate itself from that conflict and shift the burden to the Europeans. But I agree with your skepticism, Klaus, that without certain US capabilities, prospects for Ukraine are really dim.
Thank you, Gerlinde.
Can I add?
Oh, yeah, you want to come in? Yeah, please.
Just, I mean, Gerlinde, if the goal would simply be to burden shift and to shift the burden of defending Ukraine or solving Ukraine to the Europeans, then my question would be, why does the Trump administration permanently try to weaken the Europeans politically? I mean, the Trump administration, just like the Russians, they try to keep out the Europeans. So if the idea is burden shifting, that would not be a very smart way to do it. And I wouldn't say that Trump or the Trump administration have sympathy for Russia. I think what they have is a very realist view on each and every single war. And then they might say, okay, in this war, Russians have the upper hand, and Trump and Vance have hinted at that all the time. They have the upper hand, so if we want to have this war ended, they will have to win. And you could make the same point also with Israel and Gaza. I mean, Israel is the stronger country, and the Palestinians are the weaker ones. And so if you strengthen the stronger side, you will get results. You will end the war. That's a very cynical view, but I think there is something. If I try to interpret what Trump is doing, I mean, this seems to be quite a plausible rationale for him.
Well,
Thank you. Go
if
on.
I may, I would throw in that if we talk about cynicism, there's actually a lot of cynicism on the European side because we always pledge huge support for Ukraine, but what we deliver allows them just to survive the day, essentially. But it's not enough to bring Ukraine in a position of strength to alter the favor in this war in Kiev's behalf. So the notion that there will be really tough concessions that Ukraine has to make, I'm not favoring that, but it seems to be the reality on the ground. And it seems to be also a result of European policy because we have not been forthcoming with support. In some respects, we were not able to give more support. But then the question is, what is the goal that we're working towards? And in a way, maybe it forces us to be more honest in our own debates, because I see a lot of lofty rhetoric that is not matched with real deeds that would put Ukraine in a position of strength, including promises or the prospect of EU membership, which would also come with a solidarity clause similar to NATO's Article 5. Frankly, maybe I lack imagination, but I cannot imagine to see Ukraine as part of the EU anytime soon because it would require a unanimous vote, and we are so far from that. But still, the rhetoric is repeated again and again.
Thank
So
you.
I would
Thank
say,
you.
in
I
terms
think
of
we
cynicism,
need to, yeah,
there is
thank you. We
some
need
on the
to take
European
some
part.
questions, but I think you're right, Gerlinde, because the German Taurus missiles are still in their bunkers, I understand. And when we say that Trump is above all on the side of Trump, I think we can all agree with that. Abigail, do we have some interesting questions? I'm sure we have.
Yes, we do. We'll start out
Oh,
with Hadi Vincent, and the question is, do you think the US will send ground troops to Iran?
Marco, why don't you answer that?
I mean, again, you're in a better position to say that. I'm only observing that from Germany. I, I I would be very surprised if the if the Trump administration would do this, but I was also surprised, to be very honest, that they would attack Iran on a large scale, because that has been very much in contrary to what what Trump administration and his MAGA movement were campaigning for. So I don't know. Everything is possible. I hope they don't do it because I think it would be a mistake. But I don't know. You tell me.
Well, I think no one knows, but my own suspicion is that they will not, for domestic reasons. They are now talking about bringing the Kurds in, who do some heavy lifting on the ground. Whether that will be realized, we don't know, of course, but there's at least talk about that. I would be very surprised if Trump deployed ground troops in Iran, because also the danger of quite a large number of American casualties would be very high, and that would cause so much domestic backlash, particularly among the MAGA movement. I would be very skeptical or very surprised if that happened. Sivan, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. Dylan Page asks about your guys' interpretation of the motivations behind Trump's movements towards Iran. Is it potentially to distract from domestic crises, a result of the American-Israeli partnership, or is there actually some genuine truth and belief in the kind of holy war rhetoric currently being employed by Trump and military leaders?
Gerlinde, do you want to try that?
I would start by just reminding everyone that Iran really does pose a severe threat to its neighborhood, to Israel in particular. It's Iran's declared state policy to destroy the state of Israel.
That
And
reminds me, that reminds me of the rhetoric about Saddam Hussein over 20 years ago. Isn't that really correct?
What do you mean? In
Well,
terms of
we also,
explaining the
over
reasons for
20
it?
years ago, we said that Saddam Hussein was a dangerous person who would attack his neighbors, and potentially, of course, yes, but he was not about to do so. And the Iranian regime was not about to attack the Gulf states or the United States or Israel anytime soon, despite some rhetoric to the contrary coming out of Tehran. So isn't that
Well,
something we use as an excuse?
no, and I think the comparison is flawed, frankly,
Mhm.
because Iran is and has been an aggressive state towards Israel, has built up, underheld, and employed proxies that attacked Israel repeatedly, has a huge ballistic missile, and cruise missile arsenal built up with the clear intention to also target Israel, as has happened in the past, and has a nuclear program that has, as experts say, a military dimension. So it's not for civilian purposes, but it goes beyond what would be needed if it's only purely civilian. So from an Israeli point of view, it's clearly an existential threat, plus the declared rhetoric of destroying the state of Israel. And I think the Israeli calculation is that everything's better than the status quo, especially after October 7th, 2023, and the ensuing wars. So just deterrence doesn't work. I think that's the conclusion that Israel drew.
So is the
And
United States fighting a war on behalf of Israel in order to help out Israel rather than itself?
I started this way by saying what the threat level is from Iran to make clear that for Israel, I think it's very plausible and straightforward why they would act now. And we can also say Iran has been severely weakened, so it may have been a window of opportunity. From the United States point of view, as we mentioned before, the rhetoric is all over the place. So I'm not really in a position to say with confidence why now. I don't have access to classified materials. If there is anything in there that suggested an imminent threat, as has been sometimes suggested, I'm not aware of any new information that has come to light. So maybe the opportunity appeared plausible because Iran was weakened after last year's strikes, after the protests that we've seen last month, and that were brutally put down by the Iranian regime. Just to remind everyone of that
Absolutely.
again as well.
No, thank you. Let me ask the same question to Marco. Would you agree with what Gerlinde has said, or do you see it differently?
No, I fully agree with the threat assessment. I mean, I should totally agree that we should not fool ourselves and clearly state that Iran is a threat to Israel, and it's an irritant force also in the whole region, in the whole Middle East. The question that I find really difficult to answer is what are the appropriate ways to deal with the threat. So have the nuclear negotiations, the JCPOA under Obama 2015, has this all been in vain? So is that what was that? Did diplomacy really not work? I mean, we should not forget that the Trump administration withdrew from the original JCPOA, which most experts said worked. It kind of curtailed, but it had its flaws. It had its very clear flaws. It didn't address the ballistic missile threat. But then the question is an external military intervention, is an external war the appropriate way to deal with the threat? And what are the regional and the global repercussions of it? And that is where I'm very skeptical. I mean, the track record of Western military interventions in the Middle East is not very encouraging. And also it's very questionable whether this war against Iran will, really strengthen the opposition in Tehran, will really, empower the Iranian people and lead to a democratic transition. So I fully agree with Gerlinde's threat assessment, but I'm maybe as you are also, Gerlinde, I just have doubts whether this is the war is the right way to address them. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. There's a question from Milene, who's based in Beijing in China, and she is asking, and I'm summarizing, whether the nuclear negotiations which were taking place when the attack happened, were they not, could they not have been productive? Could they not have led to the desired result of dismantling any nuclear facilities, the military facilities the Iranians were aiming at?
Well, I think we don't know enough about what's been discussed behind closed doors. But what we know is that one of the major issues was whether Iran would have a independent enrichment capability. And this was, from what we know, the no-go area for the Trump administration, that they should recuse themselves from any enrichment process, period. And I think this is also some of the flaws of the 2015 JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It had an expiration date. It didn't curtail enrichment capability as such. So it gave wiggle room and leeway. And what we've seen is really a very determined effort by the Iranians to just preserve the capability to do what they may have wanted to do all along, namely invest in a military nuclear program. And they have done so over the years. And even when the JCPOA was concluded, the partial opening up of sanctions and the ability to participate in the global economy, well, what did they do with that sort of funding? They invested in ballistic missiles and other destructive policies in the region. So I think there is really a lot of reason to doubt their genuine interest in curtailing a way towards a nuclear device. I have no idea how close they were to one because we just lack the information thereof. But I can understand why one would be suspicious about Iranian motivations.
Absolutely. I think her suspicion is totally appropriate. But let me push you a bit. So war was the right way to go. It seems to come through when reading between the lines of what you said, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I have severe doubts that war is the right way to go because it has no clearly defined goal. If the aim of a military operation is to curtail Iranian capabilities, so degrade their missile stocks and those kinds of things, or attack nuclear facilities of note, maybe we don't know how much there is, but if this is the goal of an operation, it can be successful, just like last year's attacks on nuclear facilities set back the nuclear program from all that we know. But if the goal is regime change, it's a totally different game. And I am hugely skeptical. And I personally, I'm on the record saying that I don't believe that the presence in the Middle East will be really used to attack Iran. I was obviously wrong because I didn't see a plausible way how you could do regime change if this is really the goal, not just degrading capabilities, but essentially, taking away the intent of the Iranian regime. I don't see a plausible way, so I don't think it's a good idea to go to war if you don't have a clear goal.
Thank you. Abigail, do we have another question?
Yes, Joshua Tan Chu-Earn asks, what your thoughts are on the accusations that the U.S. is fighting Israel's war, and then in a similar vein, is Western Europe bound to always play second fiddle to the U.S. in security matters?
Marco, that's a difficult question.
Abigail, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure if I fully understood it.
Of course. So the first part is just what are your general thoughts on the accusations that the U.S. is always fighting Israel's war? And then the second part is Western Europe bound to always be behind the U.S. in security matters?
Okay, so I would not say that the United States is always fighting Israel's wars. I mean, obviously, the U.S.-Israeli relationship is very close, and also under the Biden administration, previous administrations, Obama has also had a very comprehensive defense relation, or initiated an even more comprehensive defense relationship with Israel. So I think that is true, but I would not say that now talking about the Iran war that is now ongoing, that the US was simply, following the lead of the Netanyahu government. I think it was a mixture of different aspects that played a role. In the end, I would say it was both the perception, both in Jerusalem and in Washington, that there is a window of opportunity to do this, to solve in quotation marks, to solve the Iranian issue once and for all, because Iran was severely weakened militarily since October 7, 2023. And because of the mass uprisings of January of this year and the crackdown and the legitimacy of the regime was openly questioned. And so I think in the end, it was definitely there was some push from Israel, but it was also, I think, that Trump had the feeling that this is a window of opportunity. So I wouldn't say this was simply fighting Israel's wars. And is Europe always lagging behind? I wouldn't say so. I would put it a bit more nuanced and say we have been lagging too far behind to provide our own defense in Europe. But at the same time, we were also lucky as Europeans not to make some of the mistakes that the US has been doing, because Europe does not have the global ambition to be, a global militarily dominant power. But we have been lagging too far behind when it comes to providing our own defense in Europe. That's how I would put it.
Thank you very much. Sivan, do we have another good question?
Yes. Scott Schwartz asks if one reason Trump initiated this entire situation towards Iran to be that he wanted to show the world he has no hesitation using force, potentially as a desire to signal to China and North Korea to refrain from aggression in their own espoused areas of influence and interest.
Gerlinde, will you want to try that?
Yeah, I like thinking about the global dimension of what we're seeing with regard to Iran, just like with regard to Venezuela, because I think it does send a clear message to China. And China receives about 90% of Iranian oil exports. If that is cut off, in addition to Venezuelan oil exports, that's not nice for China. So I think a lot of what we're seeing really has to do with China in the larger scheme of things. Also, if you think about potential future conflict in the Indo-Pacific and with China, it does make sense in theory if you try to resolve other regional issues beforehand, just to make sure that there is not the prospect of multiple wars breaking out in multiple vital theaters at the same time that are overwhelming and overburdening the United States. But then again, it all comes back to the prospect of success. Because if this operation is I don't know, a vast success, then maybe all of that is true, that China is severely weakened and then an ally is gone, etc., etc. But there are so many ifs along the way. It could well be that exactly the opposite takes place, that the United States bogs itself down in a war that is not well thought out, that was maybe started without clear intentions of where it should be headed. And even if there was a regime change in Iran with some sort of a stable, better, more democratic, more legitimate, more benign regime, I think, and I would be interested to hear what Marco has to say, the question is still out whether the region would be more American and more sympathetic to US influence and interests, or whether the exact opposite could take place, because then all of a sudden, for example, the Arab neighbors, including Saudi Arabia, would look towards Israel with much more suspicion if the Iranian threat is gone, because now what ties them together and what allows some rapprochement between Israel and its neighbors is the Iranian threat. So it's really a gamble on the future, and I'm not sure what the end result will be.
Yeah, thanks very much. These are very good points. We are running quickly out of time, and we have plenty of questions which are waiting to be asked and answered. I would say we take a few more and then we'll have to cut it short. And the final question is actually a good one, which Brian Keelev is asked, and we leave that for the end. So let me ask Abigail to ask another question.
Yes, so Nikita W., who's a UNC student, asks, what lessons can we learn from prior U.S. military interventions, and what is the consequence of an unstable, desolate Iranian state? Can this compare to potentially the aftermath of regimes in, say, Libya or Iraq?
Yeah. Marco, please.
Yeah, I mean, I will answer that question. I just want to say, I mean, what would happen if China would now attack Taiwan in this, this very situation? I think then the United States would really be in trouble, and Taiwan would really be in trouble. And so I think that is something I find. Maybe it's also partly an answer to this question that was just raised. There is just a huge risk of overreach. I mean, the United States is still militarily so dominant and is spending more on its defense than the next, I think, 15, largest military powers combined. But it cannot, it cannot dominate everything. So now starting this war against Iran exposes huge vulnerabilities, and we already talked a lot about shortages of ammunition, of air defense missiles, and so forth. So if Taiwan would happen today, the US would be really in big trouble. And on the question, I have to say, I was really surprised how little, and maybe that sounds arrogant from a European perspective, but how little the United States has learned from its past failures and mistakes in the Middle East. So that was one reason why I was really surprised that Trump decided to attack Iran full scale, because it's been over and over evident that you cannot change the political systems in the Middle East by using external force. I mean, the only thing you achieve is chaos. And Libya and Syria and Iraq are the prime examples of that. And so yeah, I was really surprised, and I think that's the lesson we have to learn, that we cannot enforce order and regimes the way we like by using force. And maybe Trump was deceived by his success in Venezuela, which was very different situation. So that's surprising to me.
Probably, Trump is hugely exaggerating the strength of the United States. But what is, I think, confirmed during the last few weeks, really, is that United States still is a unilateral power. Whatever we say when we talk about a multilateral order, in fact, it may be emerging, but it definitely hasn't arrived. So far, I think, we see still something like the unilateral moment of the United States, certainly militarily. But we can discuss that in combination with the next question to be asked by Sivan, please.
Would you like us to ask Brian's question or a different one?
Oh, different one, please.
Sure.
Let's have two more questions, one from Sivan, one from Abigail, and then we come to Brian, and then we'll thank the two speakers for their enormous efforts they are making today.
A slight pivot back to the question of rhetoric. Stuart Kaplan mentions the charges of death to America leveled from various Iranian leaders over the years. How should a country respond to continuous threats of this type? Would it be normal to just ignore them? Is that a potential justification for the conflict?
Well, if I may, the United
Yeah.
States has never just ignored Iran, but has tried to contain it, weaken Iran, essentially work on the capability side of the equation. So make sure that Iran does not have capabilities that are truly hurtful. And now with the potential for regime change, this moves from the capability side to the intention side. If you try to rearrange the domestic status quo to make sure that another type of government with other intentions, with more benign intentions, comes into power, this is really the most far-reaching effort you can undertake. And there are a lot of steps between doing nothing and going all in to change a government. And as we discussed before, if there would be a reasonable prospect for success, I think the assessment might be different. But if the fear is that there is not a well thought out plan, and maybe all that is produced is chaos or the US bogging itself down in an operation that you either have to call quits at some point, saying, we tried and gave the Iranian people the chance for liberation, but they didn't seize the opportunity and we're out. What disastrous message would that send? And I'm just very pessimistic about the prospects of where it heads. So doing nothing, no, of course not. The US has never done nothing vis-a-vis Iran, but whether going all in with the potential intention of regime change is the right answer, I have my doubts.
Thank you. Abigail, the last but one question.
Yes, Rob David asks, what future U.S. administrations could do to potentially repair any damages that have been done to international relations in the past few years?
Marco, would you?
Yes. Okay. One point to you, Klaus. You said there's a lot of indication that the United States is still this unilateral power, that the unipolar moment is still there with us. And I think the big difference is how the United States is using its power, which is still enormous. So is it using, or is it able to use this power to construct something new, regional or international order, or is it the power to destroy something? And now at this point, I see that the Trump administration is disrupting a lot of what the US has been building over the last 7 decades. I have a hard time to see the construction part of using that power. And maybe that is also the answer to the question. I mean, I think Germans and Europeans could well live with whatever administration is there. Is it a conservative administration? Is it a progressive administration, Republican, Democrat, New Republicans? I think the first and foremost thing we need is more, predictability, so that we can more easily adjust to it. And it's also that we need to be clear about the terms and conditions of that relationship. So if the United States, and I think that will be the road, wants Europeans to step up for their own defense, that's fine. Then we need to have a more constructive administration that does not, for instance, try at every point to divide the European governments against each other, as happened with what Trump did in the Oval Office when he picked Spain and the UK out as bad guys and Germany as the good guy. So that doesn't work that way. So we need a US administration in the future that says, okay, you need to do this and that. That's our expectation, but we support you politically and we don't try to divide you. I think that would be the best thing that we could expect, hopefully, from the next US administration.
Thank you, Marco. Sivan, would you ask the final question from Brian Kielev, and perhaps both of our speakers would like to address that question?
Yes, absolutely. Brian asks, if you both were to guess what the situation would be internationally and with regard to Iran in 6 weeks' time, what would you say?
Gerlinde.
Oh my God, can Marco go first? And I have a moment to think about it.
Absolutely.
It's a really tough one.
That's so mean. Oh, Gerlinde, that's so mean. I think we will still be in a quagmire. We will still be in a very uncertain place. We will not have a consolidated new government in Iran. It will be maybe the hot phase of the war will be over, but it will be lots of uncertainty. And also the regional repercussions will still be playing out in 6 weeks. So hopefully the less bombs will fall, but a lot of uncertainty politically.
What about a quick end to the war? Initially we were even told a few days would be suffice. Then now we hear a few weeks will do, because the US will use very formidable force. Why do you think that probably will have to go on for more than a few weeks?
If I may, because I might be wrong. I mean, maybe the positive scenario plays out, and we have that quick end to the war and more stability. But I think that the problem is that Iran doesn't need sophisticated ballistic missiles or its navy or its nuclear enrichment or uranium enrichment facilities to project instability. I mean, it can still use a few drones to threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. It still has also the capacity to repress the opposition internally. So I mean, to project instability, it doesn't need to have these military assets that the United States and Israel are now destroying.
Thank you. Gerlinde, have you thought about it? In 6 weeks' time, where will we be regarding perhaps the Iran war and the transatlantic relationship?
Okay, I thought hard about it, and frankly, I cannot give you a prognosis because the scenarios that we can think of are just so far apart. What we have to watch, I think, is whether there will be cracks in the security establishment in Iran, because that's the defining question, whether the regime can survive or not, whether we will see some sort of transition within or really some significant change. This is what I would watch out for. Potentially in 6 weeks, we might be talking about something totally different. Just like it's been in the first 2 months of this year. We talked about Venezuela and Greenland and I don't know, just so many things. I keep losing track of what's been on the agenda 2 weeks ago. So I have no idea what we will be talking in 6 weeks.
And in terms of transatlantic relations, do you think more of the same, or will there be a huge improvement, perhaps even?
No, I don't see a huge improvement looming on the horizon. To the contrary, I see more unpredictability and increasing strains on the relationship just because the topics become more and more hard to grasp. Just now we talk about Iran. What if the Trump administration really demands more support from the Europeans, as he has suggested just recently? I don't see that coming. So there is new potential for transatlantic conflicts, particularly since we try very hard to keep the United States on board with regard to Ukraine.
Thank you. I tried to squeeze out some optimism from you, but it's a somber assessment, which
Sorry,
both
it's
you
past midnight. There is no room for
Let's
optimism.
talk again in 4 years. Let's talk.
Yeah.
Let's talk in 4 years.
Let me thank our two speakers, Gerlinde Groitl and Marco Overhaus, for enlightening us in a very thorough and interesting way. We talked about transatlantic relations, about above all about the Iran war, and President Trump's relations regarding, again, Iran and Russia, Ukraine, and how the Europeans are supposed to deal with it all, being squeezed in the middle between all the great powers and big powers of this world. Unfortunately, the assessment was somber rather than optimistic. Perhaps when we reconvene again with the same speakers in a few months' time, in a few years' time, there will be the possibility of a more optimistic assessment. For the time being, I would like to thank you for being with us tonight. I would also like to let you know that the next Krasno event is already next week, next Thursday at 3:30 p.m. And at that time, Lord Benner from the UK House of Lords and Tentiana, another leading UK lawyer, will talk about Russia's frozen assets and whether or not the Europeans should use these frozen assets, which are largely held in Belgium, for helping Ukraine either to reconstruct or to fight the war. Russia's frozen assets next Thursday. And I hope you will all be with us again. And thank you again, Gerlinde and Marco. It was wonderful to have you. You really enlightened us. We learned a lot. And of course, thank you to Abigail and Sivan for supporting our question session. And thank you to everyone to be with us. We had a large audience. And please come back next week. Thank you very much. Good night.